Hello, everyone. Hi, Charlene. Hi, Mia. Hi, Cross. And hi, Dungeon Matron. Hope you're doing great. Okay, with me today is Dr. Tom Thompson. Again, Dr. Mr. Dungeon Matron. How are you today, sir?
I'm pretty good. I have the Gygax on my lap, so I'm sure his tail at least will make an appearance.
He's always welcome on the stream. So, Tom, today we're going to talk about Normans, yeah?
Yeah, I mean I realized as I was doing some reading a while ago that they seem to be everywhere doing everything, and yet we really kind of don't know much about it. There's sort of
Point, yep.
I don't want to say disorganized, but because they were spread so wide and because they extended over hundreds of years, it's very difficult to sort of get a grasp on it. So it just, you know, it seemed like a good opportunity to sort of give it a little bit of structure, and you go, huh, I didn't know that. I didn't know they were there. I didn't know they killed that person.
Yeah, it's not just a question of how long and how far away, around they spread, but they also kind of intermingled with quite a lot of populations. So you could say there's bits of them everywhere, rather than just being this particular block of people over here.
Right. I mean, they don't really migrate in huge clumps. They generally, when they go somewhere, they displace whatever the current ruling class is, and they certainly make their mark on the society. But they're not. Most of the time, they're not colonizers. They are rulers, and but that does differ from place to place. I mean, I would venture to guess that pretty much everybody first thinks of the Normans in 1066. Uh, at least people in the English speaking world. Suddenly, the Normans burst onto the stage in 1066 when William the Conqueror crosses the Channel and takes England. But that's not the only place they went. There are Normans ruling principalities and kingdoms in the Mediterranean. They move into Scotland. They move into Ireland. Uh, there's kind of they're anywhere that there's a chance. They do what they want to do, and they do put their stamp on a lot of cultures. And I don't know, they're very interesting because even though they are the ruling class, they do kind of adapt to wherever they go, and they adapt in different ways. They're probably one of the most pragmatic groups that I can think of, politically speaking, in the Middle Ages.
Okay, so how about we start with how they became Normans?
Okay, well, again, that's maybe something that a lot of people know. I mean, the word Norman comes from Northman, so the idea is that they were originally Vikings, and that's true to a certain degree. But certainly by 1066, they're not just Normans, or sorry, they're not just Viking. None of them are speaking Danish or Old Norse. They're all speaking a particular dialect of which has some Scandinavian words in it, but not very many. So in a lot of ways, it seems like they've been zoomed into standard continental culture. But the way that they thought of themselves is significantly different from the way anybody else in
How's that?
Europe looks at themselves. So, okay, we'll go back to the very beginning of the so-called Duchy of Normandy. And I guess
Right.
it's important to note that in the beginning, there's no such thing as the Duchy of Normandy. Arguably, there's not even a county of Normandy. Probably what the first Viking rulers in northern France were called was the Counts of Rouen. Rouen being a fairly major town on the Seine. It commands the approaches to Paris.
Okay.
And essentially, he the he wasn't the Holy, technically he wasn't the Holy Roman Emperor at that, but we'll say the Carolingian Emperor just got really tired of Viking fleet sailing up the Seine and attacking Paris
That would
because this
have been
happened on a
Charles the Simple at the time, yeah?
Yeah, I think it's Charles. I never can remember. It's one of the later emperors with another bad nickname, but they all have bad nicknames. They're Charles the Simple, Charles the Fat, whatever. Um, and he just got tired of it basically, and was like, "I've got to come up with something new," because the attacks on Paris basically happened every other year for 20 years. It
Okay.
was sacked twice, and the other times they had to buy off the raiders and give them, like 20,000 pounds. So they were just looking around for any way to stop this from happening. And eventually, what Charles or his advisors came up with was the idea that sort of like to set a thief to catch a thief. What we're going to do is we're going to have the Vikings stop the other Vikings.
Okay.
So another band came up the Seine, and the emperor said, "Hey, how about if instead of either taking Paris, which is hard to do, but you could take Paris, or us just giving you money to go away, how about if I give you land at the mouth of the Seine, and you then um, protect the mouth of the Seine against other raiders?" And he's thinking to himself, there are some problems, right? Because I'm giving Vikings a permanent spot at the mouth of the Seine. But if this works, it's great. It's going to work for Paris. It's going to work for me. Everything is going to be great. And so he talks to the head of that particular band of Vikings, who we we generally refer to him as Rollo, but that's his Latinized name in documents. Um, the thought is that his name was Hrolf. I can't say it right. It requires a lot of throat. Hrolfr the Ganger, which translates as Hrolf the Walker. And the idea is that he was so tall that he couldn't ride a horse because his legs stretched too far down and his feet touched the ground if he tried to ride a horse.
Yeah, we were talking about this before the stream, and as you were explaining, we're not talking, a full-grown horse, but more like ponies, I think you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want you to get the idea that they're tiny, but the simple fact is that the war horses that we're familiar with from the later Middle Ages haven't been bred yet. Those are horses that were essentially uh, genetically modified, if you like, by taking native Northern European breeds and crossing them with an Arabian breed that became available in Spain. So then you breed up, you get a larger horse. At this point, horses are generally pretty small throughout Northern Europe. Nobody's riding around in full plate mail or anything like that. You're wearing chainmail basically with a few bits of plate. So it's not a knight in full panoply. It's essentially small. The Vikings were used to riding small horses. One of their traditional raiding techniques was to land at the mouth of a river, spread out, grab all the horses from farms around, mount up, and basically conduct a pincer movement where you'd have small groups of Vikings moving overland on these ponies at the same time that the long ships went up the river. So there was no escape. Everybody was going to get caught in the net. So the fact that Hrolf the Ganger can touch the ground with his feet isn't as magnificent of a deed as you might think it is. Okay. But he must have been a tall guy, right, for them to even point it out. So they make the deal, and Charles says, "Okay, well, just to make sure that this takes, that everybody understands, including Charles's subject, because you have to realize there's a lot of Charles's subjects who aren't really happy about making deals with the Vikings. It doesn't look good politically.
Yeah, I can
Why are
imagine.
you giving these people who have been stealing from us and killing us for 40 years not just money to go away, but why are you giving them a permanent base?" So he has to sell it. And the way that he sells it is that he tells Rolf, you must go through the the um, uh, the ceremony of fealty. And Rolf was like, well, okay, seems okay. So they meet in what is traditionally described as a muddy field. I think that's probably an exaggeration. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing. But in any case, the point is, Charles says, yes, I'm giving you this land. It includes Rouen. You will guard the Seine against other barbarian raiders. And Rolf says, yes, you're right, I will. And Charles says, oh, wait, that's not it. You have to do something else. And Rolf says, what do I have to do? You know, I got a deal, don't we? And Charles says, no, I mean, to really sell this, you have to kiss my foot. And Rolf says, I think you probably know I'm not doing it. And Charles is like, no, you don't understand. This is part of the theater. This is how it's done. People aren't going to believe this if you don't perform the usual ceremony of essentially saying, you are giving me this land, and I am bound in field. So Rolf thinks it over and he says, well, I'm not going to do it. And he turns to one of the guys in his bodyguard and says, you do it. And the guy says, I'm not doing it. And Rolf just basically says, if you don't, I'll kill you. So the guy does it. So he moves forward and he says, now what is it I have to do? Because he probably, he's been thinking about raping and pillaging probably, so he hasn't been paying any attention. And he goes, well, you have to kiss the emperor's foot. And he's like, really? Yes. Okay. So he bends down and he takes Charles's foot in his hand and he stands back up. And the emperor just goes flat on his back. And the Viking kisses his foot. And that's how the Duchy of Normandy was found.
Okay.
So probably not true. Probably, but
it's a good story.
That is one of those moments where if I had a time machine, I'd want to go back and see it. So that is how the Vikings came to be at the mouth of the Seine. That's the supposed origin of the Duchy of Normandy. There's no question that that's more or less what happened in terms of a deal. Okay. So, but at this time, they're pagan.
Mm-hmm.
They are not French speakers. And in fact, there's nothing that stops them from using that camp at the mouth of the Seine from going over and raiding England, for example. Right. The deal is just with Charles. So as long as they protect Charles and his lands, they can do whatever they want. So it's kind of a wonderful deal for them because they get safety. They get a permanent encampment that they can fortify, that they can dominate, that is always going to be safe. And they're well within reach of Ireland and England. They can go raiding whenever they want. So that is how the Duchy of Normandy gets founded.
Okay. And thinking about, because if you look at the Vikings who settled in New York, for example, they stayed. I'm sure they mixed with the local population and stuff, but they still retain this kind of thing as, hey, we're the Danes, and their neighbors say, hey, those are the Danes. Mm-hmm. Whereas, they don't really blend into the extent that the Normans did.
Yeah, it seems as if more, again, mostly Danes, although Dane is used sort of
pretty much. Yeah.
Agree. It seems as if the Danish Vikings came over into what became Yorkshire and the Danelaw in greater numbers. They really did settle more there. There isn't a mass migration out of Scandinavia into what became essentially what happens is at the beginning, it's just Rouen. It's just a little bit around Rouen. And then gradually it grows. And the way that it grows is kind of strange in a way. But you sort of have to take into account the fact that it's not like, not as if Hrolf is like a king or anything like that. He's the leader of a war band. There are probably hundreds of war bands running around.
So he just happened to be the one who was there when
He was
they had
Johnny
that
on the
idea.
spot. They knew
Okay.
he wanted to take Paris. He had at least been in an army that had done it before. He hadn't led the army, but he was there. So they knew he was serious, and they thought this is the only way we can solve this problem. But at the same time, Charles is still being attacked all over the place by Vikings. So, as an example, at the mouth of the Loire is another. He tries to do the same deal with another Viking there named Hasting,
Okay.
and it doesn't work out because Hasting won't play by the rules. And eventually, the Vikings at the mouth of the Loire are forced out. They can't hang out there. Where do they go? They end up going to just west of where Hrolf is. They go to the
Okay.
city of Bayeux. Okay. So at that point, you have a situation where the Vikings in Rouen basically go to convince the Vikings in Bayeux that they should join up. So, and the guy who's the war leader in Bayeux, whose name is Harold, it takes about 15 years to convince him.
Oh,
But
okay.
eventually, he too is sort of brought into, I guess we'll call Normandy.
All
And
right.
so gradually, as this happens, because other war bands show up and they love to use Normandy as a base, um, more and more Viking war bands show up. They don't bring their families with them. They do intermarry with the locals, um, and so Normandy gradually goes from this little enclave around Rouen, starts spreading west, and by the time Rollo dies, it's like 910 or something like that. There really is a Normandy.
Okay.
It's
So
not just it's now much bigger. It might be a third of as big as the eventual, but it's much bigger, and it's doing the job that Charles wanted it to do.
okay, but after when once it started expanding, kind of thing, didn't the emperor say, "Oh, I think I might have an infestation on my hands" or something like that? Because
Well, yeah,
it's
I mean, and
growing.
he is worried about that. But the problem that he has is by that time, the Carolingian Empire has fallen apart so much
Yeah, I
that
guess.
those Vikings are not um, are not his first priority.
Okay. Yeah.
He's got too many other revolts going on in the heart of the empire. So these guys on the northern fringe, although it's important, they're not as important as some of the others.
They're not an immediate existential threat.
Yeah, and
Okay.
and mostly, in a way, they must have been pretty happy because the strategy is really kind of working. Paris doesn't get attacked again, so that's the big thing. So they're fairly happy with it. Um, but the result is that again, by the early 10th century, you have a recognizable territory ruled by Vikings, and a lot of them do still speak Danish or Old Norse, but fewer and fewer of them are speaking Danish and in fact, at one point, I think it was Richard I, who was the third Duke of Normandy. The third, we'll call him Dukes of Normandy. Third Duke of Normandy. He was actually sent to Bayeux to be exposed to Danish as a language.
Oh, okay. So because there weren't that many people speaking it. All right. Oh, all right.
Right, and Bayeux, as a Viking stronghold, was founded later than Rouen. So more of the population there spoke a Scandinavian language. So they wanted to maintain. You can see that they wouldn't do that if they didn't want to maintain their Scandinavian heritage somewhat, but they couldn't do it at home. Nobody was speaking, Scandinavian there. So they had to send it to basically Western Normandy, where people still spoke some kind of Scandinavian.
Right.
So there is some concern, obviously. Oh, we're losing our culture, but by and large, I won't say becoming French because there's no such thing as France, but losing the Scandinavian part is sort of that's going. So people do have Scandinavian names. I think Richard I's wife was named Gunnar. She was Danish. But more and more, it's becoming sort of non-Scandinavian in a lot of ways. So, except in one very particular and extremely important way.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to read Dungeon Meechan's question, actually. For the Normans accepted because the Carolingian Empire was falling apart because they brought stability. I think it really just comes down to they were less of a hassle than other people. They safeguarded the northern marches. There were no more Viking raids on northern France, where the Normans, held sway. So they were sort of doing their job, even if you don't like them, even if you think, well, this could turn out bad in a while. But compared to, a second son raising a rebellion in the Rhone Valley and trying to split up the empire, they weren't that important. So relatively, yes, they were more stable, but it's all relative. So the really important way that the Normans, we'll call them Normans now, I guess, held on to things was that in the late Carolingian Empire, every aristocratic house derived their legitimacy from essentially being descended from the Carolingian royal family.
Okay.
So, the Carolingian family went back, several generations before Charlemagne. So you've had over 100 years of, kids and kids having kids, et cetera, et cetera. And so, pretty much everybody who claimed to be an aristocrat of any kind claimed they were descended either from Charlemagne or Pepin the Short or Charles Martel.
Okay.
The Normans don't do that. They, in fact, take completely the opposite tack. They point out that they are not descended from any Carolingian. They point out that they were pagans and robbers. And they point out that they are legitimate by force, not favor.
All right. That's a bit of a flex.
It is. And that they're the only group I've ever heard of that use that in internal politics. Their sense of legitimacy is not based on the fact that they owed fealty to the emperor or eventually down the line. As far as they're concerned, they are better than anybody else in West Francia because they earned it. Because not only were they non-Christians who were bad, but they then converted, which is good, and they then went back and rebuilt everything that they had destroyed.
It's really funny how the wheel turns, because if you look at the beginning of the Frankish Empire, we're talking pre-Carolingians, we're talking Merovingian dynasty and then the Carolingian dynasty, but the Franks had the same thing with they came in late and then they converted, and then they became the defenders of the Vatican. Mm-hmm. And the second one is I think it was Pepin the Short who had written to the Pope and say, "Hey, dude, who's the guy who should be king? The guy wearing the crown or the guy who does the actual work?" So I think there's an interesting parallel going on there.
Yeah, I mean, and you suspect it's somewhat cultural, I guess.
Mhm.
You know, but yeah, their point was not that we came, we saw, we conquered. It's we came, we destroyed, we converted to Christianity, and we rebuilt everything we destroyed. And we didn't get it by marrying somebody. We didn't get it by inheriting somebody. We worked damn hard for it, and we're better than you. Because if you go back and look at the religious charters,
Mhm.
that every one of the Norman dukes, leaders, whatever, uh, sorry, it's a bit convoluted, but basically what it comes down to is when they came in, they burned all the monasteries. They burned all the Carolingian monasteries. They refounded every single one of them when they became duke.
Oh, right.
Okay. So they didn't found new ones to say, look at us, we're wonderful. They specifically refounded the old ones.
Okay.
We are rebuilders.
That is definitely a statement.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a different one. It's a different kind of statement because everybody founds things. You know, there's a reason that all of the Plantagenets were buried at Fontevraud Abbey, right? Okay, look, this is our abbey. It's a great abbey. We don't think they actually founded it, but in any case, you know, we're the ones that made it into a great abbey. But this is very specifically saying, it's very specifically drawing attention to the fact that we destroyed this and now we're rebuilding. So their idea is just, it's unlike anybody else. It really is. We are beholden to no one. Yeah, we know we're subjects of the King of France. That's the rules and all of that. But he doesn't really tell us what to do. We do what we want to do. And the result was that probably by the 1050s, Normandy is probably the best run, certainly the most highly militarized, and arguably for its size, the most powerful territory in Western Europe.
Right.
The only place that was probably better run was England.
Okay, how's that?
And it wasn't militarized, but the administration in England was better.
Okay. Purely in terms
So,
of administration and bureaucracy and that kind of thing?
yeah.
Right.
So there's a decent chance they think that the literacy rate in England in the 1050s, I mean, and this is part of the Dark Ages, right? They think that the literacy rate in England in the 1050s would not be reached again until about 1500.
Okay, this is what we were talking about last time in the other talk, yeah?
Yeah. So that is pretty amazing. It also means that it tailed off significantly after 10. But you know, point was it was pretty advanced, really good quality administration. It ran well. And the only place that would challenge it in any way would be Normandy.
Right.
So anyway, that's sort of how the Normans came to be. I guess they eventually shed their Scandinavianness, except for this one thing: we are proud to be former pagans and idolaters and destroyers because we've seen the depths and we came out of the depths and we're the best. So
Okay.
that's the origin of the Normans.
Okay, we've got a question from Dungeon Matron. How far south did the Danes go?
Well, that's really a question for Karl.
I have no clue. I mean,
Karl is the answer.
I mean, Danes.
The Danes went to Malta.
Yeah, I think it's around 1,100. I'm not mistaken, but
Yeah,
I believe it's
yeah,
shortly
exactly.
after the what do you call it? The Norman conquest of Britain. I think it's kind of an expansion period for them, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's so those are the Normans, and they go off, and that takes us up to — and the problem that they have had, they probably would have been more organized than they were, actually. except for the
Sorry,
fact
sorry,
that
Tom. Sorry, Tom. Hang on, because this one is really interesting. It's again from Dungeon Matron. How did they rebuild everything they destroyed without looking like they were saying, "Oops, my bad"?
Oh no, they did say, "Oops, my bad."
Oh, they did.
That was the key. Was they said, "Oops, our bad," but we were pagans, and you can't blame us because that's what pagans do. Plus, we rebuilt it, so we're even better. I mean, it's really an astonishing tack to take. I don't know who came up with this idea for them, but this is not a historian's fantasy. If you read the charters, this is what they actually say. They will actually say things like "so and so destroyed it in," and it would be some Viking, right? And now we have rebuilt it.
No, the way I'm picturing it in my head right now is like, look, contrition. We're totally Christian now.
Yeah, yeah. Look, we're doing our penance. Everything is done. We said our Hail Marys by refounding a bunch of monasteries. Everything is cool. Now we can go on. You know, it really is an amazing game that they play. So, um, so actually, let's take a step back then. So
Right.
even before everybody knows about 1066, the key, however, is that that's not the first time that the Normans do this. And I think that's something that's gotten totally lost. So, like many uh, places in history, there's sort of a problem with younger sons in Normandy, and people potentially have a lot of kids, although mortality is high. And what do you do with all of these younger sons? Now, the answer, if you were a Scandinavian 200 years later, was you go raiding. The answer, if you are a Norman in the year 1000, is you go raiding.
Right.
And maybe that's because grandpa told you a story, you know? But the point is, what else are you going to do? There's no land, right? The land is probably going to go, they're not going to split it up. You're not going to get wealth in Normandy. So what do? Because you're no longer a Viking. You start spreading out, and somehow you end up looking like your ancestors. So uh, there's a family called the Drengo family, and I can never remember the name of the first guy, but he had 5 sons, and they went where the action was, which was the Mediterranean.
Okay.
And the 5 Drengos went down there and basically became mercenaries. And at this point in southern Italy, there's this complicated fight going on. We won't get into the details between the Byzantine Empire that rules most of it, and then the Pope is interested, and then there are Lombard principalities that are down there as well. And basically, they see this as a place where they can fight, which they're good at, and maybe they can make a name for themselves and maybe even get a bit of land because they're not going to get any of that in Normandy. So the Drengos go down there and they are successful. And eventually, a Drengo takes over the Principality of Capua. So he actually becomes a local ruler. I mean, Capua is a decent sized city, the hinterland's fairly large. They've made it. But their success gives other people the same idea. So whereas 5 Drengos went to southern Italy, a little bit later, there's another family, and the head of the family is named Tancred de Hauteville. And Tancred is a particularly fertile fellow, and he has 12 sons by 2 different wives. And 10 of them go to southern Italy, and they do exactly what the Drengos do. They hire themselves out to the Lombards. They hire themselves out to the Byzantines. They hire themselves out to, for example, pretenders to the Byzantine throne. The point is just, we'll see what we can get out of this. And to cut a long story short, they eventually take over all of southern Italy. Then they take over Sicily. Then they take over Malta. Then they take over Tunisia. Then they take over Greece. Then they take over part of Palestine.
Okay, I didn't know about
These are
this.
all hot fills. And I think as a collective biography, it's one of the most amazing things I've ever read, because at the end of the day, that all sort of ends up with Frederick II, who's the Holy Roman Emperor, who is such an amazing guy that his nickname was the Wonder of the World.
Yeah, the Stupor Mundi.
Yeah, the Stupor Mundi. And this is a guy that everybody admires, fears, respects, hates, because he's just a scary human being.
Yeah, I mean,
in a good way sometimes.
There's also a long discussion about him being the Antichrist. I mean, for a
Yes,
while there,
yes.
he really had them going.
Well, as you can imagine, if you're the Pope, the last thing you want is for the Holy Roman Empire to rule everything north of you, and have the same guy be the king of Sicily and rule everything just south of you. You are now surrounded
Yeah.
by Frederick. You know, that's not a good thing if you're the Pope.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
And so he proclaimed him to be, I don't think he actually said he was the Antichrist,
It
but
was
he said
strongly...
the precursor to the Antichrist.
I think it was very strongly implied, but yeah.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And this was helped by the fact that that his court wasn't just a Christian court. He had many, many Muslim and Jewish officials as well. There's a fantastic mantle that he used to wear that was made for him by Muslim artificers. That is just a classic. Not to step too far out, but it's in the Fatimid style. The Fatimids were a group of caliphs who were based in Egypt during the. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous piece of work, and supposedly was his favorite art clothing. And somebody said to him once, what would you do if they actually depose you? Because, he was excommunicated and people were basically preaching crusades against him. And he said, I know a lot about falconry. I'd like to become a falconer. That would be funny. So he doesn't seem to have been fazed by anything, but he was effectively the last of the Hauteville. Obviously at that point, if he runs the Holy Roman Empire and he rules all of southern Italy and Sicily, and he also became king of Jerusalem, that's pretty much the high point, I would suspect. The other, at least in the south, in the north, if you want to say the high point, probably Henry II of England, who through his mother was absolutely Norman. So, and they actually lose Normandy into it. So
they lose Normandy. How'd that happen?
So the reach of the Normans is pretty incredible. Where they go into England, they go into Sicily, then there's kind of a pause, kind of wreck, and that's when the Sicilian Normans go out, basically make it all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean. Basically, this gets very strange, but let's put it this way. There's a guy named Bohemond de Hauteville, and Bohemond is the oldest son of Tancred de Hauteville's first wife.
Okay.
And that marriage was annulled, and that means that Bohemond is illegitimate. So he can't inherit. But he's a problem. He eventually becomes the ruler of Antioch. That's how far he will go to. That's the drive, right? He should have been the king of Sicily, but because he's illegitimate, they won't let him, and he's got, 1 million brothers, so it's never going to happen. But that's where he ends up. He's the king of, or he's the Count of Antioch and the Count of Tripoli.
Yeah, I mean, you're making it sound like, it's like royalty or bust. I mean, let's go over and find a place to become kings of.
Yeah, I mean, and they really, look, here's the other thing, is that by the time William the Conqueror crosses the channel.
Mhm.
Think about how many Drengos and Hotvilles have already become functionally independent princes. They're already out there doing this long before. So in that sense, rather than a beginning, the Norman conquest it's not an end because they keep going.
It's an
But
event in
it's
the whole thing, yeah.
yeah, it's midstream, So I don't know. We got anything else in the chat?
Let's see. Dungeon Matron is asking about good books to read about the Normans.
There's a really good one, just a general one called Empires of the Normans,
Okay.
by Levi Roach, and that's fun. It's a light read, but the best thing about it is he points out these are essentially family. They're family invasions. That's really,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
really what they are.
I think that's the best way of putting it because it's not like a country invading. It's literally.
Yeah. Yeah, the Norman conquest in England probably comes the closest to that. But even so, if you look at what William does after he takes England, it's his half brothers who become the largest landowners in England. You know, one other thing I guess to mention that gets lost is uh, in that sort of second leap that they do in the early 12th century, the Normans also go into Ireland. Richard, Earl of Clare, who was based in Wales, marries an Irish king's daughter. The Irish king said, "Will you have my daughter and become my ally?" And Richard said yes, and showed up in, I think it was in Leinster, which is the area around Dublin, south of Dublin as
Okay.
well. And suddenly there are Normans all over Southern Ireland as well. And then probably, in a sense, the one that's probably been written out of history the most is uh, David the First of Scotland was largely raised at the English court, uh, and he had basically been a hostage for his father's good behavior, right? Kind of stop his father from keep raiding over the border. So he was raised at the English court and was actually made Earl of Huntingdon. And when he became the King of Scotland, he brought all his friends with him. And the result is that, at least in southern Scotland, that is to say, from Edinburgh south, so in Lothian and places like that, the nobility is Norman. And no Scotsman wants to hear it, but Robert Bruce, sorry, he's not the Bruce, he was Robert Bruce, was Norman.
All right.
Yeah. So he's an icon of Scottish history, but all of his antecedents were Norman as well, as were most of the so-called claimants that were claiming the throne at the same time. Balliol and Comyn and people, and had all been brought in. Their families had all been brought in by David, and they tended to hold lands in both England and Scotland. So, that's how far you can't just pay attention to borders. The Normans were quite happy to own land wherever they could get it.
So thinking about it, because we'll be talking about Normans going in and replacing the leadership of wherever they happen to decide to go, but was there kind of like a Norman middle class or a Norman peasant class, or was it just, we let everyone else do the work, we just go reading?
Yeah, no, they didn't bring peasants, but what they did do, and again, this is just practicality. For all that there are towns in Normandy, Rouen is a good-sized town, obviously. Bayeux is a pretty good-sized town. No, they were very smart. What they did was they went to the Low Countries, which was much more heavily urbanized, and they invited the Flemings in. They would actually go to, Ghent, Bruges, wherever, and recruit Flemings to come over and help set up new towns. And the Normans founded many, many, many new towns in England.
All right, that's interesting.
Yeah. The other thing is, and that's in the north. So again, we're talking in England mostly. If you were to go, if the on the other hand, you were to go down into the Mediterranean, when they took over places like Sicily or Greece, and it's southern Greece, not all of today. In places like Sicily, the city, the economy of the cities was largely in the hands of at least in Sicily, Jews and Muslims. In the cities, they basically let them alone. When they took over Sicily, every time they took a Muslim-run city, they said, "You can worship, you can practice your faith. We won't take your land. Nothing like that. You just keep running things." Because it's the goose that lays the golden eggs.
Yeah, I mean, just instead of paying the taxes to him, you're paying the taxes to me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And they did the same thing in Greece. They were like, there it tended to be Greek merchants.
yeah.
Keep
I mean,
going.
it's the
Everything's fine.
same thing that happened here because at the time I forgot if it was the Fatimids or the Abbasids, but basically the Normans yoinked it from whoever was there at the time. So and
Yeah, I mean,
again, no change
so
of anything.
they had a very, very good eye for the main chance. They were not going to. They learned a lesson, I think, from taking over Normandy. But in all of these places, where it's like, no, we want the economy to flourish, obviously, because we're going to collect taxes, and that's fine. But we're not going to do anything to screw it. We're not going to be religious zealots. They do finally in Sicily, 150 years later, they do expel all of the Muslims on the island after there's a Muslim revolt.
Mm-hmm.
But it took an actual revolt to get them to do it. It wasn't stimulated by by somebody preaching.
Yeah, it was literally a political / security issue here at that point.
Exactly. I mean, it's very much like what the United States did with Japanese Americans at the beginning, too. Because it was William II, I think, of Sicily, deported them all to Italy. He didn't deport them to North Africa. He deported them to Italy. Kind of.
Okay.
So it very practical people. They realized you needed an economy and you needed economies don't run themselves. You need people who know what they're doing to do it for you. And so they made sure that it happened forever. And it's kind of similar to essentially when William the Conqueror, I don't know if harrying of the North is hard to get a grip on it. So what happened was initially when William took over England, he really tried to keep things pretty much the way they were. The one thing that he did change was it used to be that earldoms were much larger. They were regional titles, not shire titles, which is kind of so when Harold Godwinson was the Earl of Wessex before he became King of England, he effectively had all of southwestern England as Wessex. Okay, there was an Earl of East Anglia, and it was all of East Anglia. It wasn't just Norfolk or Suffolk or Cambridgeshire. So he did break that up so that now you were going to be Earl of a smaller area.
Is that to reduce the chances of rebellion or whatever?
Yes, and it worked on the Normans that he was giving land to. The problem is that in the north, it didn't work, and it's not a coincidence that the people who were earls in the north were still Anglo-Saxons.
Uh-huh.
So the population up there and the leadership was still Anglo-Saxon and Danish. And so when he tried to be nice, he tried to play nice for about 10 years, and it didn't work. And finally there was a huge rebellion in the north, and that's when you get the harrying of the north. And, there aren't records so that we can tell what happened, but it looks as if he probably, one way or another, through starvation, whatever, probably killed about 100,000 people. Because he was like, look, I tried. And he even said, there are even documents that say this. I tried. Your tax burden is no heavier than anywhere else. All I asked is that you not revolt. And you revolt. That's it. And at that point, he wipes out every Anglo-Saxon or Dane who's in the aristocracy. Okay, he removes them from positions of power. Okay, fine. You've shown you can't be trusted. I gave you a chance. You blew it. Okay, and the North is a pain. It's not going to be a pain anymore. I'm going to teach you a lesson. And the result is that if you look at the Doomsday Book, which was put together in 1086, there's village after village after village that is just listed as waste. Whoa. It's been wasted. It produces nothing. So this is, there's always been a divide between northern and southern England. This doesn't.
Say again, sorry, this doesn't?
It doesn't help. It just makes it more, there's more of a break between. So it was, so in that sense, you have the Normans who are descended from the Danes, specifically targeting the population of northern England for large.
All right, I think that ties into what a question that Dungeon Matron asked here. Interesting how their culture made such a drastic change from what they were. How did this fare with the Danes they came from? Well, apparently not very well.
No, I mean, but again, if the Danes in eastern and northern England had just played the game, it would have been absolutely fine. William was pretty practical. Like a lot of these folks, he had to deal with the fact that he had, multiple sons and they were always all rebelling. Half the time he had to go and put down a revolt. One of his sons would do something. He's like, I'd just like to get on with conquering Wales. Would that be possible? Could you guys just stop rebelling for a couple of years so I could take Wales? And he took a shot, but he just never could really. So
yeah, I'm guessing they were past the age where he could send them to their rooms or whatever.
He could try, but then when his after he dies, there's this massive civil war between brothers as well, because his oldest son gets the Duchy of Normandy. His second son becomes King of England. His son, who's the King of England, who is William II, is mysteriously killed in a hunting accident.
Oh, no.
And there's thought that this is something that was engineered by the second son, who not only wanted to be Duke of Normandy, but also King of England.
Oh, surely not.
When
has that ever happened?
No. Why would that happen? Hunting's dangerous, sure. Perfectly plausible that one of the guys, behind him on a horse shot him in the back. But then the problem becomes that it's really, really bad timing, and the son who wants to become king is in Normandy, and his younger brother, the third brother, is like, wait a minute, I'm here in England. And so he heads to Winchester, which is still the capital at that point, confiscates the royal treasury, and has himself crowned King of England. And then when his older brother complains about it, he takes Normandy away from his older and says, you can't be in Normandy. I think it would be a good idea if you go on crusade. And so his older brother goes, his force basically go off on crusade. Families, right?
Yeah.
That's very common. You see very similar things going on with the Hauteville family.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. But
Italy.
Thinking about it, how was the division of property between children? Because if I remember correctly, for example, the Carolingian way was just to literally split equally between all male heirs.
And that's traditional. That's traditional Frankish practice. It is not traditional in Scandinavia, and the reason there is that the land. Again, if you think about the topography, there's already no land.
Pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, the farm is already tiny and isolated. You have 5 sons like the Drengos, or God forbid, 12 like the Hautevilles. What are you going to do with all of these extra guys? Because what are you going to do? Give them a potato patch each? You can't do that. So whereas on the continent, it was at least somewhat more possible to split the inheritance. That was not really true in Scandinavia. And in fact, it used to be considered that was the primary reason for the Vikings suddenly exploding out of Scandinavia around 800, is that it was just sheer population pressure, that the land couldn't support the people on it, and they had to go somewhere and do something.
Yeah, pretty much.
They went to Lindisfarne and killed 40 monks. Um, so I mean, that is that. So the idea that you have to, it's not primogeniture. Primogeniture doesn't really happen until later. And remember that primogeniture is like, it's going to the eldest son.
Everything goes to the eldest son, and then
everything goes to the eldest son.
We'll figure out what
This
to do
is
with the
not
others later.
what the Normans are doing early on is not that. What they are doing is doing their best to provide for everybody, but in a very, very practical manner. So when William the Conqueror died, the thought, we think of England as the primary realm. It was not. Normandy was the primary realm. And his oldest son got Normandy. And that's important because Normandy was a unit. It was an administrative unit already. So he's not really splitting up something that's unitary. England is another unit. I mean, he's still running, in a lot of ways, the old Anglo-Saxon administration. So when he gives that to his second son, he's giving him a unit. But he only has 2 units, which is why his third son only gets cash.
Okay.
Does it work? No, it doesn't, because clearly the third son is like, I could be king of England and Duke of Normandy if I want. So it ultimately doesn't work, but they're trying to be practical about it. They're not tied into, the eldest son has to inherit. Nor are they tied into, we must divide everything equally. And again, the same thing tends to happen in Southern Europe. Things get split up, but then there's once, I think it's Roger II says, Roger II's an interesting guy. He's really the guy that conquers Sicily. Because what he does is he's like, I own Sicily. Sicily is mine. And in the old days, unspecified, it used to be a kingdom. I think I should be a king. So the Pope says he won't let me be a king. So I'm going to create an anti-Pope who will declare me king. So that's what he does. He supports an anti-Pope. And in return for that support, the anti-Pope says, you are now king of Sicily. He then, and then the anti-Pope dies. However that happens. And
let's call it mysterious circumstances.
Again, probably hunting in the New Forest, just like William II. That was a bad time to be hunting there. And at that point, Roger defeats the Pope in battle, and the Pope says, and captures the Pope, and the Pope 3 days later declares Roger to be king of Sicily. So it all worked out.
I love Norman diplomacy.
Yeah, I mean, they're just like, we know what we want, we know what we have to do to get it, we'll get it. It's that simple. They are, in a lot of ways, they are efficiency experts. They really are. So yeah, the heir problem for them is more like, in the early years of the Duchy of Normandy, there are too few legitimate heirs, and in fact, they have to legitimize some people late.
All right.
To get legitimate heirs. So, who was it? Can't remember. Right around 1000, right around the year 1000. That might be Richard I. So, Richard I was married to a Danish woman named Gunnar, and they were married according to what the church calls Danica More, which is basically Danish ways, right? Danish mores, which is not recognized by the church. There was no church wedding. It's more like a handfast, or not really common law, because it's generally recognized.
Okay, but
he was unofficially married to her.
So we're saying on paper all his children were illegitimate. Is what we're saying. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, nobody's making an issue out until they want one of their sons to be named Archbishop of Rouen. At which point the church says, we haven't really had a problem with you not going through an official church ceremony, but it is kind of a problem to have your son become an archbishop. Okay, so we're okay with doing that, but in return to that, you have to get married in the church. And so, sort of like Henry IV saying Paris is worth a mass, Richard and Gunnar go, oh, okay, I guess we'll get married in a church. So they get married in a church, and a week later, their son becomes the Archbishop of Rouen. So again, practicality, right? They're sort of like, well, this is fine, but now the conditions have changed. There's something else we want. We're going to have to, change what we're doing. So it's some evidence that Scandinavian customs were still going 100 years after Rollo showed up, but it also shows how they are accommodating to the customs of their new homeland as well.
Yeah, I'm guessing. I mean, if it wasn't too much of a bother, roll with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other, there's so William the Conqueror has I think he has two half brothers. One is a guy named Robert, Count of Mortain, who becomes, I think, other than William, the largest landowner in the West. But the other is a man named Odo, and that's usually spelled Udis, Eudes.
I think it's usually the same to Odo, yeah? Odio.
Yeah, exactly. So his name was actually Odo, but in Latin it just changed from Latin. Odo was the Bishop of Bayeux. Okay, so he was a high-ranking church official. Sort of in the top 10 list, Odo is usually ranked in the top 5 warriors for William the Conqueror. And he is apparently the source for the cleric class.
Yeah, I remember reading that, yeah.
Yeah, because he always made a point, like, I am a warrior, I'm as good as any other warrior, but, these vows are kind of inconvenient, so I'm just going to use a mace. I'm not going to use anything that cuts.
That sheds blood.
I'm just going to bludgeon to death.
It's kind of weird because, impact injuries tend to, there's a lot of blood coming out there.
Yes. Well, again, we're at the beginning of the medieval period, really. So nobody is wearing plate. So in a sense, you don't have to have a long-bladed sword. I mean, you certainly can, but if you think about it, if it's flexible, all you have to do is crush.
Yep.
And a mace will do that just as well as anything else, arguably better than a sword. So Odo fought at the Battle of Hastings. Odo became, I think it was Earl of Essex. Odo was the guy who apparently helped commission the Bayeux Tapestry. The problem is that Odo probably should have paid more attention to his religious vocation, because he eventually rose up in rebellion, and
whoops,
and that was never a good thing to do against William, and he ended up essentially losing all of his titles and lands, and died a man, again, as most of William's did. But yeah, just the fact that he is the guy that probably is the progenitor of Eric Klein.
Yeah, I think I remember reading that specifically. Yeah. I think it's even in the second edition AD&D one was like, for example, this guy.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's a perfect, and he's not the only one by any means. I mean, if you look at, for example, the Teutonic Knights or whatever, you get that again. They are clearly fighters first, and bishops later.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've got popes leading armies to war, so it's not like a random one-off.
Yeah. So, but anyway, that is really the culture. This is a lot about the culture that the Normans bring with them, which is everybody is a fighting.
Speaking of,
you have Flemings to do the economy, and you have Gallo-Roman serfs in Normandy, or Anglo-Saxons to take care of the fields in England, and we fight. That's what we do. That is our heritage, and they're not alone in that. I mean, that's the aristocratic ethos, so to speak.
Yeah, now that I think about it, I remember reading that I forget if it was the Bishop of Rouen. Might be somewhere else, but I think it was the Bishop of Rouen. Had special dispensation to say mass, or sorry, to have his sword on the altar while he was saying mass.
Yeah, it would make perfect sense. I mean, he would. The other thing that you remember is like this is a really interconnected world, much more interconnected than we think it is. Because again, there's this sort of idea, oh, people didn't travel, which is crazy. They traveled all the time. Again, look at the Normans. Oh, sorry, this is a weird little thing that I'll bring up. So in the 1050s, when the Hotvilles were really just starting to emerge in southern Italy, they uh, they fought on the side. They were acting as mercenaries, and they fought on the side of a claimant to the Byzantine throne, whose name was like Melfi or something like that. Anyway, point being, that's the side they were. So the Byzantine Empire mobilized a expeditionary then to southern Italy, and it was comprised of some Greek troops. It had uh, um, some other Norman mercenaries as well, but also a detachment of the Varangian Guard. So the leader of, because everybody knew the Normans were really good, the leader of the Pretenders' forces was a Hauteville. The leader of the Varangian Guard detachment was Harold Hardrada.
All right.
And in 1066, Harold Hardrada invaded England right before William the Conqueror invaded England. So you've got the Normans meeting the Varangians, who are their cousins, in southern Italy in 1050, and 15 years later, they're meeting again in Italy or in England. So the reach is incredible.
So the Norman,
Anything else going on?
let's see, Dungeon is saying, so the Normans were chaotic neutral?
No. It would never be chaotic because I mean, I would say they were actually lawful neutral. They fought as mercenaries, and once something was in a structure, they were like, no, this is the way it's got to be. I will say, however, that they would change if you convinced them. You know, if you look at the way they ran Sicily, there are lots of situations where there would be petitions presented by, a local Muslim merchants guild, and they would actually change the law in response. Part of being practical, you know. But again, lawful neutral. They don't want you to step out of line. Once it's been agreed upon as to how things are going to go, don't mess with it because they don't like it. But yeah, I mean, they have the problem that all medieval aristocratic families have, which is they eventually run out.
Say again, sorry.
They run out of heirs, and that's the problem that everybody has.
Oh.
Is when everything is personal. You know, the crisis comes for the Normans, at least initially, when Henry I's only son, dies in in the White Ship accident in, I don't know, what is it, 1190, like that. The heir to the throne dies on a voyage from Normandy to England, and his illegitimate half brother dies as well. His illegitimate half sister dies on the same ship. Pretty much all of his buddies die on that ship, and the result is that there's no direct male heir to the Kingdom of England and the Duchy of Normandy. And so Henry I has to try to get everybody on board with his daughter becoming, and he goes around and has every baron swear allegiance to his daughter. And so you think, well, there's a problem with that because she's a woman. We've already said that they're a little more open to having a woman on the throne, and I still think that's true by that point. The real opposition to her comes from the fact that she's the wife of the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Normans don't want foreigners coming in.
All right.
You know, they don't want foreigners coming in. The Normans have got this all staked out. They don't want anybody messing with their deal. So we don't want Matilda and the Holy Roman Empire messing up what we have going here. So the result is that her cousin, who is male, claims the throne. And then you get what's called the anarchy, which is 15 years of civil war, at the end of which everybody agrees that her son, who becomes Henry II, who is raised essentially in Normandy, will become King of England. But his problem is exactly the opposite. He has too many sons, and they are constantly rebelling again. So that's Richard, Geoffrey, John. These are people that we've seen a lot in movies. So, it's either feast or famine, and that is a problem that the Normans face, like every other family.
Okay, so question, culturally, is there anything that, apart from the organization kind of thing, do they have any consistent culture across these various pop-up kingdoms, or I don't know.
Well,
I
I mean,
don't know to
they
articulate the
clearly
question.
go back and forth between them. There's constantly, like we were talking about with the Vikings, where Karl manages to set up his little area, and then there are other Viking bands that come through. So there's a lot of continued contact among all of them, and certainly in the Mediterranean. Let's put it this way: it's a Hautville who basically perfects the techniques of transporting horses by ship on a larger scale,
All right.
that somehow made it back from the Mediterranean to William in Normandy.
Okay.
So there are people moving between these various Norman ruled kingdoms all the time, because again, you get a letter from a distant cousin saying, "Hey, things are great here in Sicily. Why don't you come join me?" And then you get there and you realize, oh, it's too late. They've already grabbed all the good land. They're not going to go after Malta for another 10 years. I'm just going to go home. You go home, you get home, and they ask you how it was. And you're like, I got there too late. There's no land to be gotten. I mean, they're going to keep going, but I don't want to wait. And then you hear that, the Duke of Normandy is putting together an army to go to England. And you're like, hey, that's great. I'll go and do that. So there is, I think, it's not continuity between all of the different areas, but there's a lot of contact. There's information spreading between all of them all the time, and especially after Bohemond gets to Palestine in the First Crusade. And to get to Bohemond, or to just go out on a crusade, you have to pass by every one of these Norman-run countries. You have to, if you're in Northern Europe, you can go south across the Alps. If you're in Northern Europe, you have to go by Normandy. If you then get into the Mediterranean, you will now go through Sicilian waters. You will now go through Greek waters. You will eventually get to Bohemond on the east coast of the Mediterranean. So, the connectivity is really there.
I got you.
Oh, and actually, just to put an exclamation mark at the end of that, if you look at, is it Frederick? No, it's Roger II, king of Sicily. So we're talking about when is he? Yeah, about 1116. If you look at his top level administrators, there are Muslims, there are Jews, there are Normans, there are Englishmen, and there are Danes.
Okay.
But they're all running things in Sicily. So that says something about it's a long way, but they seem to be able to do it without too much trouble.
Yeah, for sure. Thinking about it, because very correctly that Jerusalem was also kept open, so same method of administration that we were talking about earlier. So hey, if you did this and you keep doing that thing, if you did the money stuff, you keep doing the money stuff, and you know.
Yeah, well,
So
because it was even more mixed up than
yeah,
a place like
exactly.
Sicily. Yeah.
So
Um,
okay,
but
but I
yeah,
see where
and
that's coming from.
eventually, by the way, there's a Hotville descendant who is not Frederick II, but there's actually who would it be? Great great grandson of Tancred Hotville is the king of Jerusalem in the around 1190, suppose it is, and in Jerusalem, that the claim to that kingdom is largely passed through women.
That's all right.
Yeah,
How come?
yeah. Well, first of all, again, they start running out of people at a certain point. I mean, there's a certain uh, problem when every man in your family is a professional fighter. Okay, so and infant mortality is high. It kind of tends to
Yeah, I get you.
squeeze the, you know. Um, so what they end up with is, I mean, this happens in Sicily, this happens in Antioch, and it happens in Jerusalem. You end up with either just daughters who survive, or widows. And so frequently, what will happen is, because the kingdom of Jerusalem is a weird combination. It's both hereditary and elective.
All right.
So you kind of elect people based on how strong their claim is and whether it'll work for you. It's very strange. Anyway, the point being that there is a Hotville widow who then marries, is it Fulk of Anjou, I think? Who Anjou, by the way, is just south of Normandy, so from the same area. It's also the home of Henry II of England. Um, and so she's the widow of a Hotville Count of Antioch, and she marries. Sorry, they tell her what she needs to do, or she'll become Queen of Jerusalem if she marries Fulk of Anjou. So she marries Fulk of Anjou. They have a daughter. They both die. Her only daughter, who by this point has no Hotville blood whatsoever, but is being promoted as a Hotville,
Okay.
then marries somebody else. I can't remember it now, where it's getting really into the weeds, but who then marries somebody else who is then elected king of Jerusalem. So it gets, the lines, we like to think of the Middle Ages as having this sort of feudal structure and primogeniture and all of this. It's never that clean. It's never that. It's always so messy, and it's really about who has a claim on something. Is it a better claim? Sometimes that'll work. Sometimes it's just about you're in the right place at the right time. And just like the Vikings saying, we earned it, we took it by force, it did not come to us by favor or by marriage or by inheritance. Okay, that's why they do great in the Mediterranean. Is the structures aren't as strong there, so they can just go in and take it, and it's like instant legitimacy. We can
Yeah.
do it. We're good at it. We're good at it. We have a track record. And by the way, don't mess with us, because yeah. So a lot of, I think there's a lot of, probably too much attention being paid to, like, oh, are they like their Viking ancestors? Well,
Yeah.
in
Exactly.
some
Yeah.
ways, they're acquisitive. They go a long way in search of what they want, which is, generally speaking, land and riches and power. I'm not sure that makes them that different from anybody else. They do seem to have a certain drive. They, like a lot of families, they do have their internal feuds, but somehow, at least the Hotville, well, it's true of the the Conqueror's family too. They tend to stop just short of reaching meltdown, so that the family at certain points will come together. And like when Bohemond was declared illegitimate and he was told he could not inherit the kingdom of Sicily, as a compensation for that, they gave him the city of Taranto in southern Italy, and I think another county. But then his brother, his half brother, who was legitimate and who did inherit, said, I'm not really comfortable with that. You understand, right? And Bohemond apparently said, oh, I get it. And his brother said, I will back you if you want to go and take Greece. Because that solves both of our problems and it aggrandizes the family. So that's what happened. And Bohemond took a lot of southern Greece. Now, eventually, the Byzantine Empire kicked back.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they didn't like that.
Yeah. And Bohemond went back to his brother, Roger Borsa, and said, okay, that didn't work. And Roger said, I can't mount a whole nother expedition. But I have this idea. There's this crusade thing that Pope Pius is. Why don't you go with that? We'll get you guys for that. And so, for all of the ideas that the Crusades are great religious things, you get people like Bohemond who tagged along, and when they got to Constantinople, made the same oath that every other Crusader leader did, which is any lands that I conquer, I will give to the Byzantine Empire, because it's clearly the country, the empire that can safeguard the Holy Lands the best. They're the closest.
Absolutely, that's exactly what we're going to do.
Yeah, sure. Like it, there was one guy who actually said he would do it. He just never did. None of the rest of them ever gave up anything. But most of them, at least, went through the crusade and then said, no, we're not giving you anything. Bohemond, however, just peeled off immediately, went down, took Antioch, and said, that's it, I'm out. Good luck with taking Jerusalem, but this is now this is Hotville country now. This is ours. Okay, I'm not giving it to the Greek emperor in Constantinople. I'm not going to say, sure, the king of Jerusalem is my superior. And more than that, my brother is also not my superior because I now rule an independent principality. So, they're thinking on a variety of different levels. Sure, it's good that we took this from the Muslims. Sure, that's good. It's even better that it's the Hotvilles that took it. And it's even better that I took it. And at the end of the day, you have this string of Hotville principalities stretching all the way from the Western Mediterranean all the way to Palestine.
That's pretty awesome. It's raiding on a whole different level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are strategic thinkers. They really are.
Yeah, I mean, look, instead of stealing sheep and treasure, they're stealing entire cities.
Mm-hmm. No, they don't think small.
Yeah.
They realize that you have to do small things to get larger things, but the goal is always big. And it's interesting. Once they take one, I mean, they really think this out. Once they get control of Sicily and southern Italy, and they do move down and take Malta, and Roger does grab Tunisia, and then it's lost in his son's reign. And there's very clearly discussions going on at high levels about, is it worthwhile to try to get Tunisia, or as they call it then, back? And the answer is no. It's not worth it. We already control the trade routes by owning Sicily and Malta. We don't need to put blood and treasure, and we'll be attacked constantly. We don't need to do that. We're going to sit on what we have. We're not going to go north up the Italian peninsula, because that'll get us into trouble with the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. We're going to sit on what we have and make it work. So, I mean, they are real strategic. The one place that they are thinking about expanding is west, there is one expedition that kind of scopes out the Balearic Islands.
All right. And
And they don't do anything about it. They don't think it's worthwhile.
Okay.
But they are at least looking, always looking. So, and again, I mean, if the Conqueror could have, he would have taken Scotland, and the Normans who had gotten into Wales would have been happy to have taken Ireland. So they do not think small.
Yeah, and I like this last point you made that it's not like Pac-Man just gobbling up land. It's like, okay, it almost sounds like a corporation. It's like, okay, where should we invest next?
Yeah, it's like a like a chaebol, the family-run South Korean conglomerates. They fight amongst themselves all the time. They argue over who's going to be the heir, and at the end of the day, what's good for the family is important. They don't want to sink the family because the family is ultimately the source of all of their power. So you don't mess with that. And I think they all realize that you have to put up with a certain amount of infighting in order to be able to harness all that energy when you really need it. Now, obviously, when Bohemond is dispossessed effectively twice by his brother, he is not pleased with his brother.
I wouldn't think so, no.
On the other hand, there is a serious revolt by two of the Lombard princes so just south of the Papal States against Bohemond's brother. Bohemond drops what he's doing in Greece, turns around with 20,000 men, and completely destroys one of those Lombard principalities.
Again, because of the protection of the family kind of thing?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. So, and in fact, I wish I had a copy of it. When Bohemond was in Constantinople, he, like the other leaders of the First Crusade, met with the Emperor Alexios. And Alexios I think she was a 14-year-old daughter.
Anna Komnena? I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Anna, yeah. And she describes all of the leaders because she was allowed to be at these meetings because she was being trained basically to be empress. And she describes all of them. And she's not particularly negative about them. I mean, they're not Greek, so they're barbarians, sort of by definition, right? But she gives fairly realistic description of him. And then she gets to Bohemond. And she says something like, I swear to God, it's like listening to a 14-year-old today talk about a pop idol. He's like, oh my God, he's tall and he doesn't wear his hair long like the other guys. He stands out. He has broad shoulders and a narrow waist. I mean, it's just, it's fangirl stuff like you would not believe. And then there's a follow-up letter that she did where she writes a friend of hers, and she says, and they say there are 11 more like him. And it's I mean, that apparently is the way the Hotvilles came across. Incredible charisma, and ability. I mean, they have a track record. So, yeah.
I think I remember.
14-year-old girls love
it. I do remember. I'm not sure if it was Normans or Vikings, but I'm almost certain it was Vikings. But some nobles had complained because these people bathe regularly and they wash their hair and stuff, and they're taking away all the they're getting all the ladies' attention.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, that's absolutely true. Yeah. It's like they are. It's terrible that they bathe regularly. How dare they? No. Well, look, it's exactly the same thing that the English said when the U.S. Army and Air Force descended on England during World War II.
Okay, good.
Which is, they said there's the problem with the Americans is that they're oversexed, overpaid, and over here. Okay, so that obviously there's guys just going, oh, they're taking all the girls, and to be able to hear a Saxon saying that over 1,000 years ago, basically, it's the same thing. This has got to stop. They're taking all the girls. Um, but how far? The dungeon matron asked how much time it passed when Anna took since the Norman invasion. So that would have been in 1095. So that would have been 30 years after the Norman conquest. So not very long. Um, but how different are the Normans from the Vikings? The answer is really, really super different because for one thing, they're Christian, right? But on the other hand, they're perfectly happy to say, no, we're like the Vikings because the Vikings have a rep. And so do
Point,
we.
yes. Hmm.
Okay. And look, we'd like to appropriate a little bit of the fear and respect that the memories of the Vikings invoke. And if you look at, for example, the boats that never can remember which one it was, whatever, that he developed in Sicily to carry horses, and you
Roger,
look at the ones in the Bayeux Tapestry.
Roger the second, I think you mentioned.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. But the boats are exactly the same.
All right.
They are adaptations of longships. They are a little
Oh,
shorter than longships because you want a slightly broader beam because you're going to have the horses. You want to be able to put a horse on each side. Okay, so essentially, what I remember the exact thing. What he came up with was a way that he could put 10,000 troops, 300 ships, and that had never been done before. I mean, at least since classical times.
yeah, good point. Because I'm guessing that a lot of things had to be re-engineered.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you're putting horses on a ship, you have to reinforce stuff. It's you have to be careful. But so I like to think of them as Christianized, evolved Vikings.
Okay, but
You know,
also the point of the raiding was different because they're not stealing stuff to take back home. They're stealing
mm-hmm.
stuff to make it their new home.
Well, remember, even with the Vikings, yes, the initial phase is stealing it to take it home. But at some point, as Rolf indicates, oh wait, it is an option to stay. We never thought about that option before. But now it is becoming an option that we don't just go in, steal it all, and go home. It's still fine if you want to do that. That's fine. Nobody's saying you can't do that. But we have this other option. And he's not the only person doing it. It's just that he's very successful and well known because of where he's situated. But there are people doing that all over. And if you think of like when Alfred defeated Guthrum in whenever it was 880, the basically the terms of the agreement, the peace treaty, so to speak, was Guthrum and his men would convert to Christianity. And he would go back not to Scandinavia, but to East Anglia. And he would become the king of East Anglia and settle there.
Oh, actually, that's an interesting point because Alfred had Guthrum convert to Christianity as part of his agreement, kind of thing. But if I understood correctly, that wasn't imposed on Rolf.
Excuse me. I think when you look at that treaty, you have to remember that the Vikings had already taken Northumbria and Mercia and East Anglia. So it's kind of an interesting situation where really what this is doing is it's saying you must leave Wessex. Okay. And Guthrum, because again, by this time, there are Danish kings ruling in Northumbria. and Mercia, basically. But East Anglia, you've recently killed the king, so you have to go there. That's the place that has a power vacuum. You go there, settle down, everything will be cool. So it's not a peace treaty in the sense of we won. And that's what a lot of these things are, is how do you, in that sense, it's very similar to how Karl became Count of Rouen, right? It's the political side of it that they're trying to set up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does.
Yeah. Where they get into trouble later is that they don't is that they make the mistake that Charles the Simple realized was a mistake, which is they just keep trying to buy them off.
Okay,
And that's
yeah.
not going to work. And one of the reasons that's not going to work is that it means that the Vikings that are coming to raid you are those that don't want to settle down.
Excuse me, are you the ones that don't?
So if as Ethelred did, you pay the Dane Guild every time somebody invades, and you say, "Here's 5,000 pounds of silver," and they say, "Okay, we'll go away." That group has agreed to go away, which means that they're not a group that's immediately looking for land.
Mm-hmm.
So they come back the next year and say, "We're here again, and we're going to lay waste to everything unless you give us another 5,000 pounds of silver." And so Ethelred gives them 5,000 pounds of silver, and they go away. So what you're doing is you're incentivizing raiders rather than settlers, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah, I get you.
Okay, so Charles figured it out. He was like, "No, we need them to stop raiding, at least stop raiding us. Get them to settle down. That's fine." Okay, what Athelred did was, on the other hand, do exactly the wrong thing. Not that paying somebody off is necessarily wrong, but you can't do it the way that he did it.
And you definitely can't do it indefinitely. Yeah.
Yes, look, the Vikings, the raiders, were like, "Oh, we get this. This is great." And eventually, what they would do, and again, this is in about the year 1000. So just as the Duchy of Normandy is starting to take shape, is raiders would come from Scandinavia, go to England, say, "Give us 5,000 pounds of silver or else." Athelred would give them 5,000 pounds of silver. Would they go home? No, they'd go to Normandy, where there were people that spoke Danish, settle down for the winter, and now they just had a really easy row across the channel the next spring to go, "Give me 5,000 pounds of silver."
They moved to shorten their commute.
Absolutely. I mean, none of these people, again, are they toiling peasants or whatever? No, smart people. And and it was because that was so obvious. I mean, Ethelred's epithet is the unready, which is not what it actually means. It means like bad counseled, and he was badly counseled. The way that they tried to solve this was exactly the wrong way, as it turned out. Because the way that they solved it was they had Ethelred marry the daughter of the Duke of Normandy, who, as part of the marriage negotiations, said, "Sure, I won't let the Vikings winter in Normandy anymore." Okay. Well, the problem is Normandy doesn't control the entire northern edge of France. So Vikings who were raiding could still winter in northern France. Just they needed plausible deniability. That's all that the Dukes of Normandy needed, right? They just were like, "No, we're not letting them into Rouen. They're not trading in Bayeux. They're over somewhere to the west. They're in Brittany or something." Okay, nothing to do with us. So they still wintered in northern France. Or sometimes they went all the way around and went to Ireland and wintered there. And then they just had a nice short trip across, the Bristol, the Irish Sea, or the English Channel to go and demand their protected country. So it didn't work. But again, the fact that Ethelred married Emma of Normandy is ultimately what put them in this problem of Normandy having a claim on the English throne. So,
Okay.
they tried to solve a problem that was probably bearable, not wonderful, but bearable. They ultimately ended up creating a situation that led to the end of Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, I mean, that consequences coming home.
Yeah, I mean, and it's hard to blame them for not seeing that was going to happen in 60.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a longer term thing.
Yeah, and and I guess the other thing is that that at that point, the Anglo-Saxon language and what was really Old Norse were still mutually intelligible.
Okay.
They weren't exactly the same language anymore, but you could converse. So we tend to think of it as Scandinavians attacking, the British or the English, right? But in fact, there was a general knowledge that there was a sort of community of language. Okay. So I remember watching this at one point. There was a guy who was doing a history of English, and there's a valley in Yorkshire where on one side of the valley, the local dialect still pronounces the word horse as horse. On the other side of the valley, it's pronounced as cross. So the R moved forward. This side was English. This side was Danish, or probably North. That.
All right.
But it's that close. The basic things that people would have talked about were so close that it's not an either or situation. They were much closer than we usually conceive of them.
Yeah, I think
as being.
I think in modern discourse, I think we tend to focus on hey, this nationality, this country, again, like borders, like you said. I don't think they really care that much about any of those.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because of course if you look at a map of Normandy today, it tells you nothing about what Normandy used to be. Absolutely nothing. And it's 800 years since the Anglo-Normans ruled. But there would, if you did a linguistic map of Normandy in the year 1000, there would have been decently large pockets around Rouen, Bayeux, some other towns, where half of the population spoke what I guess we could euphemistically call Scandinavian. The countryside would be Old French.
Okay. Right.
If you went to England and looked, you would see big pockets of Scandinavian in East Anglia, in what they called the five boroughs, which were like Derby, Leicester, Nottingham, and around York. But even if you do that, you're missing the fact that if you're inside the Scandinavian pocket in York, you can talk across that line on the map to the guy on the other side without too much trouble.
I got you.
Yeah. So as it ends up, we end up making these distinctions as hard and fast distinctions, and they simply weren't there. And that feeds into the willingness of people like the Hautevilles to adapt and include people in their administrations. You took the expertise, you took the knowledge, you took it where you could get it, because it wasn't really common. So the idea of why did William want England? Okay, well, he was French, he was Norman. Well, yes, he was, and he didn't speak Anglo-Saxon. But he certainly had people in his family who did. He certainly had people in his administration who did. And so he knew that England was wealthy, it was potentially powerful, it was well run, it was more heavily populated than Normandy.
Really?
And it was well worth taking. And the other thing to remember is that we talk about Anglo-Saxon England, but in certain parts of England at the time of the conquest, the ruling class was still Danish. They'd had 40 years of Danish kings on the throne. Harold Godwinson's father was Danish. So a lot of these are artificially drawn distinctions. Like many things, there's a spectrum. And at some point, the Vikings moved along that spectrum and became Normans. And at some point, the Normans moved along that line and became Anglo-Normans. Or, if they were in Ireland, Hiberno-Normans. You know? So I think that's one of the really fascinating things about the Normans is that they touch so many different places in so many different ways that they were forced to interact with so many different cultures in so many different ways. And so the details, whether they're, you know, weird little things like a Hauteville fighting Harold Hardrada in southern Italy, for God's sakes. I mean, you're talking about a Norman and a Norwegian fighting in southern Italy. You know, things like that, I think, to sort of testify to how far they were willing to go to get, to reach their goals.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and I don't think Hauteville and Hardrada would have been able to speak to each other, but they would have had cousins that could speak to each other.
All right. Still, I mean, it's like this massive web that goes together in some ways. I mean, exploring this would be super interesting.
Well, you can't do it with maps. You can't do it.
Yeah, no way.
Yeah, it just doesn't work. If the more you try to get specifics, the more it just squeezes away from you, because culture is like that. Culture is, it's like gel.
Yeah, well, I mean,
the more you squeeze it, the less you hold of it.
What I've been getting is that, like, you expand on one point and, oh, look at all these other points. It would be super interesting to explore. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the, and then, you can keep going with this. You can go to Henry II. You can go to, all the way through, certainly through John, into Henry the First, to Henry III. You can go up through the end of the Plantagenets, or, you can go from Frederick II. You can go all the way to Frederick II and the Holy Roman Empire. You can go to the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These are all Norman ruled, at least, entities. And, how many thousands of miles apart are they?
Yeah, I mean, you've got practically literally, it's the length of the Mediterranean.
Yeah. I mean, it's all the way from Edinburgh to Jerusalem. And I think, no, David does it. I was going to say, I thought David the First went on crusade. He may have actually gone on crusade. So you could have had a king of Scotland going to visit a distant cousin in Palestine.
Yeah, I think.
But it's the secondary ones, I think, that I find fascinating. That all of the Normans that go to Ireland, the ones that basically take over southern Scotland. Because those don't get mentioned. Everybody knows the Norman conquest. I think a fair number of people know about Sicily, but that second jump out remains largely unknown.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know about Greece, for example.
Yeah, the Duchy of Achaia and places like that, and eventually that all gets taken over primarily by Venice. The reason for that is that the last Hauteville heir in Antioch sells her claim to much of southern Greece and to Cyprus to the Venetian Republic.
All right.
So we're now in the 15th century.
Oh, okay, that far.
That's how. I mean, that's how far this thing extends, and that's the point at which Venice acquires southern Greece, Cyprus and things.
I got you.
So, it again, drop a pebble in a pond, you see these ripples that just keep going.
That's a fascinating thing in itself. Okay, so I see that there's one last question before we wrap up. So, Dungeon Matron, why didn't the Normans bother to ship horses when they could just take the horses during the invasion?
Yeah, I think one of the answers was, trained horses. Okay, that's true. I don't know that they cared that much, but the fact was you couldn't be sure there were going to be horses.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So if you ship some across, you will always have that body of mounted men that you can use as a scouting party, or whatever.
Yeah,
And
where I see it, any horses that they would have found that would be usable in battle would have had Saxons on top of them.
right. No, the general Norman ability to figure out what they needed to do and then doing it is pretty impressive. When Bohemond, for example, gets to Antioch in whatever it is, 1095, 96, whatever, the garrison of the city is bigger than his band. It's not an army. He takes the city. He manages to scale the walls and take the city. And not a chance that he should have been in. But he figures it out. So sometimes sometimes they'll bribe people, sometimes they'll just walk up and can't remember who it was, but it was somebody else. It was another Norman knight who took one of the major strongholds. It was like maybe in Tripoli or Edessa or something like that. He literally walked up to the main gate and said, "Lay down your arms. We're here to take the city." He had 25 men with him. They surrendered immediately.
I need to try that out.
Pure confidence. Just, they're drawn up. They're clearly ready to go. And they were just like, okay. So I don't know how much of that was reputation going before them. I don't know how much of that was confidence. I don't, maybe they were all holding severed heads. I don't know. But there are things like that. It's very strange. And of course, it probably did help that it was well known that if a city surrendered to the Hotvilles, you got very, very, very good. There wasn't looting. They didn't burn the town. Their interest was in not maintaining the status quo, because they were going to change the status quo, but they were going to keep the administration going. Sure, they probably tweaked a bit, changed a couple of people and all of that, but they weren't ultimately there to destroy. I think that was the lesson that Rollo and his son taught their successors and their nobles was, if you destroy, you end up having to rebuild. Somebody said that whoever it was very smart. If you destroy and you stay, you have to rebuild. If you destroy and leave, you don't have to. But once Hrolf had committed himself, they were going to have to rebuild it. So that was a great lesson for all of the Norman adventurers after him. And the fact that I'm continuing to be amazed by the guys in Sicily, because they'd been in Sicily for maybe 50 years by the time they unified it. And so they spoke the language, they knew what was going on. It wasn't an issue, really. And nobody else was really claiming it. They could have done anything they wanted. There was nobody, it was too far away from everybody else. The Byzantines couldn't reach it. The Muslims couldn't reach it. The Pope didn't want it and couldn't reach it. The Holy Roman Empire couldn't get it. So they could have done whatever they wanted with the place. And instead of just taking everything and destroying it, moving on, they stayed and they took the bureaucracy as it existed. They tweaked it a little bit, and it became probably, with the exception of their cousins in England, the best run, most progressive and advanced government in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, to tell you what, I'll be honest, I'm thinking that that's the kind of lesson that some people who are in management should learn. It's like,
yes,
you don't get a new manager. New manager just decides, okay, we're going to change over everything because I said so.
Well, so I have a question for you, Karl.
Shoot.
So, you went to school in Malta, correct?
Yep.
Okay. So do they talk about the Normans? I mean, other than the sort of, hey, there's a Norman cathedral, kind of thing.
There's no, I mean it's been 30 years now, but if I remember correctly, it was a very short paragraph.
Jeez.
Something, if I remember correctly, about I think it was Roger II, but here they only refer to him as Count Roger because he wasn't a king at the time, so just Count.
Right.
There's this whole thing about liberating the Catholic people from the Muslim government, which technically he did, but he also didn't because he left literally everything in place and just, again,
Right.
please send the taxes here.
Yeah. Yeah. Theoretically, that's true.
And yeah, there's also this legend that he, cut up part of his standard and gave it to us to use as a flag, which is completely made up. So
Yeah.
and that's all the history of Normandy.
And that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's it. Now, I suppose you could argue, like, Malta's been it was almost completely depopulated, right, at one point. And
at least 2 or 3 points, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's mostly resettled, I think, from Sicily, which makes sense.
I should think so.
Yeah, I think the fascinating the even after talking about the Normans came and they obviously were French speakers and they were Catholics and they didn't really push Catholicism as much as they probably could have, right? But at the same time, that would have changed the liturgical language of the island because
yes, good point. Because at that time it was in Greek.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, gradually that occurred over a period of time.
But not immediately.
But it wasn't a policy of the Hotvilles to go, okay, you're speaking Greek when you're in church, but now we're going to make you speak Latin. Okay, that was not the way they approached things, finally. But if it hadn't been for that, because it's a long period of time and it's a crucial period of time, it seems to me that Maltese as a language, and it's a pretty special language in the sense of, well, it's the only Arabic-based language in Europe, right?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. If the Hotvilles had taken the line that a lot of people took, Maltese wouldn't be that way today.
I am not entirely sure it would have made a difference.
Yeah, I mean, in other places, people were, when you change the liturgical language, you change the ruling class language, you change, and obviously you're repopulating, you're bringing mostly Sicilians and peninsular Italians in. It's hard to imagine Maltese as a separate language would have existed. It would have been colonized. But because the Hotvilles made it work, so to speak, Maltese remains a sort of an interesting offshoot. You know what I mean?
Definitely. But I don't think the main difference would be the liturgical language, specifically because Greek is not a large component of Maltese.
True.
However, because they left the Semitic population in place until, again, same thing, revolt, and then, hey, you guys, get out. I think that left, I'm not sure how much more, but a few decades, if not 100 years or so more of development, which, integrated more in spread it more out.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is it bought time.
Yeah.
You got another couple hundred years where nobody was trying to get rid of it. Where it was nobody's priority to get rid of it, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, again, if nothing had happened, I think they were perfectly happy to just let things keep going on exactly as they were.
Yeah, if it works, don't fix it.
Yeah.
So The other thing that I always wonder is because they did rule parts of North Africa for a relatively short period of time, is I wonder if I wonder if their approach. I'm going to go back and look this up. If their approach in their North African provinces was the same,
Hmm.
because it's a different strategic situation because you're literally surrounded by enemies on all sides who by definition want you out, you know. So can you afford to be the same way there, to administrate the same way there that you can in Sicily? um make Again, the Hotville's changed their policy to fit whatever they needed to do, so it's quite possible that they rule differently in Ifriqiya than they did in. Oh, I don't know. I'm gonna look that one up because that would be quite interesting.
Yeah, it would
Uh,
be.
you know, so
So, one more question from Lisa. Are there a lot of Norman ruins in Malta? I believe we have exactly 0 Norman ruins. I counted them
yeah,
twice.
yeah. I mean, I kind of looked at some of the cathedrals and stuff. There are cathedrals that were built by the Normans, but some of them are simply Norman facades you know, put onto older buildings. Um,
We
so it,
okay. We definitely have parts of buildings that are Norman, but look, if we have a ruin here, there isn't a lot of space here. So if there's a ruin, chances are that it got torn down and rebuilt.
right, right. You may have one, but it's got 500 more years of
Yeah,
stuff, and
exactly.
probably the Knights of St. John dismantled it and rebuilt something completely different anyway, right?
Yeah, that's
Because
a that's
they
a
were there longer than the Normans.
that's a
So
fair guess.
yeah, that's are all Norman. Yeah, the dreaded historian's answer to questions like that is yes and no. Are Normans all from Normandy? By definition, yes. In reality, no. Um, because, and this is something that I think even historians of English history keep forgetting, is there was a time when when England was a part of Normandy. Normandy was never a part of England. Well, okay, that's not true. Later on, Normandy became a part of England, but for a couple of hundred years, England was a part of Normandy because the ruling family thought of themselves as Normans. Their identity was Norman. They spoke Norman French. Their homes were in Normandy. Quite a few of them were buried in Normandy. Many of them were born in Normandy. They got married in Normandy. So, so you end up in a situation it's probably by the middle of the 14th century where for the first time the languages are separating, in the sense that English is that version of English that existed at that time. It's kind of making a comeback. At the same time that politically, the question, you get to the whole problem of politically, Normandy is supposed to be a part of France. It is a duchy in France. You own fealty to the King of France, but you are simultaneously the King of England, who doesn't owe fealty to the King of France. So about that time, it starts to become this problem of identity starts to show up. It doesn't really show up before that. It shows up during the Hundred Years' War when barons or folk who have land in both England and Normandy forced to choose. Who am I going with here? Because technically my land is in France, but technically my other land is in England. I I hold it directly from the king sometimes in England. I never hold it directly from the king in France, but I do hold it from the duke who holds it from the king. So the issue of who's a Norman and who isn't, if you were to ask somebody in 1100, it wouldn't even be a question. If it was a member of the ruling class, 99% of the time it's a Norman. If you asked in 1200, you would start to have problems because by that time, the Norman Empire, or the Angevin Empire, as it's sometimes called, is so big that Normans don't dominate it like they used to. Henry II owns so much of France and so much of Wales and so much of Ireland and England that Normans do not, people actually from Normandy, do not dominate. And then in 1204, John loses the Duchy of Normandy. And then nobody's Norman. So, so who's normal after that point? Does Norman equal normal? I don't know. It's traditionally that's the point at which historians start talking about the fact that's when you move from Norman England to English England.
Okay. So, Tom, before we wrap up, do you have any books to recommend apart from Empire of the Normans?
Yeah, if you want to get into it, I will tell you this is one that's really a noodly book, but I loved it as I got into it.
Oh,
There's
I like to discover.
book called it's called Heirs of the Vikings.
Again, Heirs of the Vikings.
Heirs of the Vikings. Heirs,
Okay.
not AIRS. Heirs of the Vikings. And it's by Catherine Cross. That's Catherine with a K. And if you're interested in how that transition from Viking to Norman occurred, it's incredibly good, because what she does is she looks at charters, among other things. She looks at histories written at the time, chronicles written at the time, but charters especially say things like, my ancestors destroyed the abbey and I am rebuilding it, and this is the right thing to do. So it's not just I'm doing a good thing, it's my ancestors did a bad thing. So that kind of takes us back to one of the things we talked about at the beginning, where these early sort of proto-Normans are like, we're badasses, you all need to remember this, and don't mess with us. But we're also builders, we're also creators, we're worthy of the responsibility. But don't ever forget what else we do. Okay. So she looks at charters for things like that. She also has a section on what titles they used. So as I said, nobody calls anybody the Duke of Normandy for 100 years after Hrolf gets that territory. He's usually referred to as, well, sometimes the Lord of Rouen, the Count of Rouen, and then gradually as the duchy, or again, whatever. The area that he rules gets larger, and his son, William Longsword, as he gathers in more and more land. You see the titles change. And there are literally ones where they can't figure out what their titles are because it hasn't been regularized. This early in the feudal setup, nothing's written in stone. So you'll see charters where the so-called Duke is called, say, William II. So William, Count, Duke, Prince, and Lord of Rouen, Normandy, whatever. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't start to solidify until well into the.
All right, that's it.
Yeah, so it's very strange. So she digs into stuff like that to see how they identified themselves, who was speaking Scandinavian still, like I said, the existence of another pocket in Bayeux, which is later and at least initially independent of Hrolf's sort of regime around Rouen, is I think a key to understanding how they get to where they are. It's a process that goes on for a long time. They don't just suddenly convert to Christianity and become French. Long time, and they do it eventually. And so by the time William comes across the Channel, he's not speaking a language or necessarily dressed like his cousin. But that relationship is literally a cousin. It's very, very close. So anyway, those two. The other one, the Levi Roach book, The Empires of the Normans, is also just good for the broad scope. Whereas the Catherine Cross book is really focusing in on, what makes a Norman a Norman.
Okay. So, Tom, thank you so much for this. This has been incredibly interesting.
Yeah, they are fascinating people, and it's just one of those things where you hit. It's very common in history. You see the high points. You see a timeline. This is when so and so invaded this. This is when blah blah blah. This is when they. In between those dates, that's where all the real work.
Oh yeah.
That's where 10 sons of Tancred de Hauteville just get fed up and are like, "There's nothing here for us at home. We got to leave. We got to go somewhere," And look where they end up.
It is. I mean, I don't know if whether to call it badass or just super interesting. But there's just so much to dig into here. I love this stuff.
Yeah, well, again, the Normans, you can go anywhere and do anything because they went everywhere and did everything.
Okay, so thank you again for this, and
sure, always happy to do it.
We will have to do another one soon, but you have to pick the subject. So let's have some fun with
that. That's
that.
okay. That's the great thing about history is it contains everything, so it's never ending. You can always find something.
Good point. And thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you have a lovely week. Bye.
Bye, folks.
Bye.